I was only planning to do 3 talks on the In Search of the Miraculous, but I had quite a response to it, and so I thought of a few points which I didn't emphasize. Now, I may have given the impression that I'm very scornful about any sort of parapsychological attempts to get magical results under test conditions. The fact is that they don't interest me very much, and that's why I don't have a fund of wonderful stories. But it doesn't mean that I despise that type of approach. And in fact, when I first started being interested in these subjects back in the 50s, there wasn't much around, except I used to read up, Harry Price and the early Psycho Research Society people. So that's how I began. And also, I had a neighbor who was trying to use psychic means to win money in the football pools, and he used me as a seer as a child. And we didn't win any great prizes, but it was successful enough that he kept going, using me over a few years. So that would have been the end of it, except when I went to Cambridge, there was a Psycho Research Society, and I was attracted because there was a sort of a new movement in psycho-research. What had happened during the 50s and the beginning of the 60s was that psycho-research had moved very much towards the really large-scale statistical tests. People endlessly guessing Xena cards for thousands and thousands and thousands of goes to see if they get a slightly statistically significant, better than average result. And those tests were incredibly boring. And in fact, what they tended to find was that very often in the first few tests you got some rather remarkable results, but as soon as you went on continuing to get statistical significance, they would taper off towards the normal. So what the new spirit of the psycho-research was, maybe we should try to get something which is more engaging, something more interesting, to try to keep that initial interest to get better results. And so one of the tests that I got involved in was about having senders and receivers, but instead of just going over and over and over and over with many repeated things all the same, what they did is got these senders, gave them about 5 minutes to come up with a strong, simple image and to draw it. And then the receivers were hypnotized, told to make their minds blank, and then allow an image to come up. And they were asked about that image, to describe it over, perhaps 10 minutes or so. And then at the end, to draw the image that had finally emerged. And I was one of the receivers. Now, I saw an image of a road, straight road going to the distance towards the sunset. And so it was very disappointing to find that what the person had sent was a picture of a volcano. And so that would have been disappointing until one looked at the pictures, because what they did, interestingly, was to say, well, we can't, it's too much to expect that, someone draws a hen and the other person draws a hen. Maybe there's something about the picture which, although it might look very different, other people might recognize and say, I reckon this one matches that. To see subjectively at the end how other people put the pictures together. Now, the volcano that was sent to me was like that. There's the cone of the lava, and there's the flames at the top and the smoke, and there's a dribble of lava coming down here, all in red. The picture I drew looked like that. Straight road going towards the sunset, and in the middle there is my attempt at drawing the white and the dotted line going up along the centre of the road. Now, of course, you see, visually, those pictures have got a lot in common. it was together. An impressive result. But what struck me was that it's almost as though the verbalization of the brain, the left side, left brain business of verbalizing was the one that had kept us apart. A volcano, a road, very, very different. It had separated our two pictures, whereas when we actually saw what we'd seen side by side, we had something which had a lot in common. So that was quite an interesting experiment for me, and we did a number of other things along those lines. But I didn't really pursue the interest at all. And I would say that for the rest of my life, I didn't bother about doing objective tests on the strange things that happened. But I can think of one example where I did actually test, not because I was trying to get sort of scientific verification, but simply another reason to test is if something rather embarrassing has happened. The occasion was the evening, the night after I'd been involved in a very powerful, emotionally involving ritual. And I was staying at a friend's house, and I came back at about 1 or 2 in the morning when everyone was asleep, came into the house, went into the sitting room, slumped to the sofa to recover, and the television set switched on right across the room, a large room. Now, that was a weird manifestation, but I did need to test it because this was a bit embarrassing in someone else's house. Was it meant to happen? Had they put on a recording or something which I might have been interrupting? Or have I sat on their remote or something like that? So I inspected very carefully. I looked around to see if there was a remote anywhere on where I'd sat down or might have touched on the way in, and there wasn't any. The remotes were far away. And was a timer set or something like that? I inspected very carefully. And the next day I told them what had happened, and I said, were you recording things? No, it had come on in the middle of a football match, something that they wouldn't have been interested in whatsoever. Has this ever happened before? No, not to their knowledge. And they looked at it and everything was normal. So, for my own reasons, I had in fact tested this very thoroughly and gotten a very strange result. But of course, again, this isn't anything to astound a skeptic because it's just a hearsay. Just as with the telepathy experiment, a skeptic would say, well, probably the person asking me the questions had given me leading questions which had led me to a similar design. So I just present those to show that I'm not totally above testing results. It's just that it is not a thing that directly interests me. Another thing I've mentioned in passing was the way that over my lifetime stories had evolved, and I gave the comparison between Tolkien's handling of magic versus much later the Harry Potter way that magic is handled. Just to enlarge on that, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when people had this very sort of mechanistic view of the world, inspired by Victorian science, the perfect story, ghost story, was really the Hound of the Baskervilles. Because here is a story which is creepy and spooky, this phantom hound going across the empty moors at night with phosphorescent jaws, that sort of thing. Nice, spooky spine chiller. And yet, at the end, Sherlock Holmes explains it all away. It was a great big mastiff with phosphorescent stuff put on its jaws in order to frighten the local people into not going out at night so that smugglers could get away with their dirty deeds. So there is a good old spine chiller completely explained away at the end. And that tradition survived for a lot of the century. In fact, in my time, Psycho, the Hitchcock thriller, very, very weird movie, but it's all explained away. Now, appropriately for my generation, the explanation is a psychological one. The Bates Motel, the guy has got an obsession with his dead mother, so on and so forth. But it's explained away. Now, even more suitable for my generation is something like the X-Files, where the perfect ghost story is one where everything's almost explained away, but something doesn't quite fit. Some little detail isn't totally explained, leaving a little bit of mystery in the air. And this is the sort of movie where if it would be in The Hound of the Baskervilles, it'll all be explained away at the end, and yet when the person walks home that night across the moors, he hears a weird howling. Not quite tied up. And then, as I said, we got the more modern stories like The Leftovers, where something really objectively magical has happened, and how does the world cope with it? The third thing I wanted to refer to was this process I refer to normalization, where something apparently magical, the brain explains it away and normalizes it. Now, when I put that to, I think it was a Chaos conference in Manchester in the 80s, someone raised the interesting question of, yes, I know that a lot of these phenomena get normalized, but what about when the opposite happens? When people get really weird explanations, where, say, a UFO phenomenon or a witch hunt, where quite ordinary things suddenly be seen in terms of mysterious witchy things happening. And that was interesting because it actually points out that the normalization process is actually towards occult acceptance. What is the culture brought up in? Because that is what is normal. Going right back to my early thing about, why is it, if magic doesn't exist, why are all these stories about it? And they said, oh, well, if you're brought up in a civilization that believes in this magic nonsense and werewolves and things, then you'll see them because you've been brainwashed into believing they can happen. And so for me, brought up in a rational world view, the cult of rationality, normalization meant I tended to rationalize things, as most people in our society would. But it's true that if I'd been brought up as a sort of fundamentalist Christian, I might have seen biblical explanations of things that happened. That would have been the normalizing. And if I brought up a very keen UFO fanatic, I might have seen UFOs where other people saw weather balloons, and so on. So when I talk about normalization, I really mean normalizing towards the herd mind, the cult that you're brought up in, what is considered normal. Because if you go outside that, you then risk being thrown out of your cult or your tribe, because you become an outsider, seeing weird things, you're mad. So that is really what the process of normalization means. Now there's one other thing which I'd like to talk about, and that is the word magical. The way it is used gives people a wrong idea about magic, but I'd rather cover that in a separate video at a later stage.